Good evening. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to read a scene from the novel in which two of the principal characters are meeting for the first time. This is a scene set in Calcutta. The year is 1968, and at one point I refer to something called Naxalbari, which is an attempted Maoist revolutionary movement that begins in 1967 and by now is beginning to attract a great number of students. Normally she stayed on the balcony reading or kept to an adjacent room as her brother and Udayan studied and smoked and drank cups of tea. Manoj had befriended him at Calcutta University, where they were both graduate students in the physics department. Much of the time, their books on the behaviors of liquids and gases would sit ignored as they talked about the repercussions of Naxalbari and commented on the day's events. The discussions strayed to the insurgencies in Indochina and in Latin American countries. In the case of Cuba, it wasn't even a mass movement, Udayan pointed out, just a small group attacking the right targets. All over the world, students were gaining momentum, standing up to exploitative systems. It was another example of Newton's second law of motion, he joked. Force equals mass times acceleration. Manoj was skeptical. What could they, urban students, claim to know about peasant life? Nothing, Udayan said. We need to learn from them. Through an open doorway, she saw him, tall but slight of build, 23 but looking a bit older. His clothing hung on him loosely. He wore kurtas, but also European-style shirts, irreverently, the top portion unbuttoned, the bottom untucked, the sleeves rolled back past the elbow. He sat in the room where they listened to the radio, on the bed that served as a sofa where, at night, Gauri slept. His arms were lean, his fingers too long for the small porcelain cups of tea her family served him, which he drained in just a few gulps. His hair was wavy, the brows thick, the eyes languid and dark. His hand seemed an extension of his voice, always in motion, embellishing the things he said. Even as he argued, he smiled easily. His upper teeth overlapped slightly, as if there were one too many of them. From the beginning, the attraction was there. He never said anything to Gauri if she happened to brush by, never glancing, never acknowledging that she was Manoj's younger sister, until the day the houseboy was out on an errand and Manoj asked Gauri if she minded making them some tea. She could not find a tray to put the teacups on. She carried them in, nudging open the door to the room with her shoulder. Looking up at her an instant longer than he needed to, Udayan took the cup from her hands. The groove between his mouth and nose was deep, clean-shaven. Still looking at her, he posed his first question. "Where do you study?" he asked. Because she went to presidency and Calcutta University was just next door, she searched for him on the quadrangle and among the bookstalls, at the tables of the coffee house if she went there with a group of friends. Something told her he did not go to his classes as regularly as she did. She began to watch for him from the generous balcony that wrapped around the two sides of her grandparents' flat, overlooking the intersection where Cornwallis Street began. It became something for her to do. Then one day she spotted him, amazed that she knew which of the hundreds of dark heads was his. He was standing on the opposite corner, buying a pack of cigarettes. Then he was crossing the street, a cotton book bag over his shoulder, glancing both ways, walking toward their flat. She crouched below the filigree, under the clothes drying on the line, worried that he would look up and see her. 2 minutes later, she heard footsteps climbing the stairwell, and then the rattle of the iron knocker on the door of the flat. She heard the door being opened, the houseboy letting him in. It was an afternoon. Everyone, including Manoj, happened to be out, and she'd been reading alone. She wondered if he'd turn back, given that Manoj wasn't there. Instead, a moment later, he stepped out onto the balcony. "No one else here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Will you talk to me then?" The laundry was damp. Some of her petticoats and blouses were clipped to the line. The material of the blouses was tailored to the shape of her upper torso, her breasts. He unclipped one of the blouses and put it further down the line to make room. He did this slowly, a mild tremor in his fingers forcing him to focus more than another person might on the task. Standing beside him, she was aware of his height, the slight stoop in his shoulders, the angle at which he held his face. He struck a match against the side of a box and lit a cigarette, cupping his whole hand over his mouth when he drew the cigarette to his lips. The houseboy brought out biscuits and tea. They overlooked the intersection from 4 flights above. They stood beside one another, both of them leaning into the railing. Together, they took in the stone buildings with their decrepit grandeur that lined the streets, their tired columns, their crumbling cornices, their sullied shades. Her face was supported by the discreet barrier of her hand. His arm hung over the edge. The burning cigarette was in his fingers. The sleeves of his Punjabi were rolled up, exposing the veins running from his wrist to the crook of the elbow. They were prominent, the blood in them greenish-gray, like a pointed archway below the skin. There was something elemental about so many human beings in motion at once, walking, sitting in buses and trams, pulling or being pulled along in rickshaws. On the other side of the street, there were a few gold and silver shops, all in a row, with mirrored walls and ceilings, always crowded with families, endlessly reflected, placing orders for wedding jewels. There was the press where they took their clothes to be ironed, the store where Gauri bought her ink, her notebooks, narrow sweet shops where trays of confections were studded with flies. The panwala sat cross-legged at one corner under a bare bulb, spreading white lime paste on stacks of betel leaves. A traffic constable stood at the center in his helmet on his little box, blowing a whistle and waving his arms. The clamor of so many motors, of so many scooters and lorries and buses and cars filled their ears. "I like this view," he said. Thank you.